Hello, Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, 7 years after the owners of the Times Picayune announced that the daily would be reduced to 3 home-delivered editions a week, the newspaper returned this week as a daily with a different owner and carrying an extra name. We'll look tonight at the latest in the saga that made journalism history. We'll also look at a plea bargain in the first NBC bank failure, as well as concerns over a crime increase in the French Quarter, plus more priests linked to a sexual scandal, and the latest activity from the port. On an upbeat note, we will hear about the companion musical careers of Dave Bartholomew and Fats Domino. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Eric Paulson, reporter and news anchor at WWL-TV Channel 4, Kathy Finn, freelance business journalist, and Ramon Antonio Vargas, reporter, and this is the first time that we're going to be saying this, the Times Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. All right, we're going to go over to Errol first to talk about the Times Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, and other things happening in the media this week.
Speaking of which, this was the last Sunday's newspaper. It was the last paper published by the Newhouses. And I think the headline on top, the TP Daily Home Delivery resumes this week. You know, if somebody saw this and said, "Oh, this is a story that was 7 years in the making." You know, it may have seemed like, well, just a change of mind or something, but there was such a story behind it with the coming of the Advocate and the George's involvement and all the negotiations that went back and forth. And so it was really just a really major development. And there was a statement on the front page from John Shea, who's now identified as the publisher, or I'm sorry, Dan Shea. And he says, the Times Picayune is a great publication, and we're going to make it even greater by delivering it to your doorstep 7 days a week, which is what the readers wanted all along. And so we finally got to this point. Yeah. So it was quite a development. And in terms of when people write the history of print journalism in New Orleans, I think this is at least a chapter or the most a footnote, because it's really unusual for a local newspaper, for a small group, to have essentially bought out a big national company. And I know, Eric, you've been following this also with the...
Well, I interviewed Peter Kovacs, who is the editor over at the Times Picayune, New Orleans Advocate. And you know, he was saying he only knows of one other case where something like this has happened. I mean, it is unusual. There are monumental changes going on in print media, in broadcast media, but print was way ahead of the game on the big changes. And it does seem like, I mean, because from I can't remember, but up until probably the early 1900s to 1970 or 80 or so, there were like 500 papers went under. And I mean, when we see them go under all the time, or we see mergers happening like we see with the Advocate and the Picayune. It's just, it's a changing landscape. And I asked, one of the things I asked Peter when we were talking is, I assumed, because in the beginning it was going to be the Advocate and the Times Picayune. They were going to keep the name Times Picayune. But then in a last minute move, they decided to switch the names, because the Times Picayune is, of course, the bigger name. And I assume after a while, because I asked Peter this, that they'll probably lose the New Orleans Advocate, because then they have the Advocate in Baton Rouge and the Picayune here. I mean, the Advocate, the NewOrleansAdvocate.com, send you over to, I'm not sure you can even get it anymore. Yeah. I deleted it from my phone, but it goes to NOLA.com.
With the way they identified Dan Shea, and saying, instead of saying he's the publisher of the Picayune Advocate, it says he is the publisher of the Times Picayune as well as the publisher of the New Orleans Advocate. And so they set it up as actually being two separate publications.
Yeah, yeah. And you've got to hand it to John and Dathel Georges for doing this, because, and I said this to Peter that day we interviewed, every city needs a strong newspaper. And even though we see readership diminishing, a strong newspaper is so important. And all of us who have been here for a long time, we remember when there were two major papers in this town. You'd have a morning and an afternoon paper. And then when that went away, it was a changing of an era. And then all of a sudden, when the Picayune went to 3 days a week, it was like, it was the death knell. And then they moved their operations out of town. just changed everything.
And when this happened in 2012, I think there was a feeling that this was going to be the beginning of a national trend, that this is going to be going on throughout, and it hasn't happened.
No. They thought they were way ahead of the game on that and going to digital, more digital than the print media and medium.
Well, it's hard to make money. It's
it
still
is.
hard to make money on the digital side. And this, even though now they're going back to a single paper, it doesn't change the economics. The fact that paper costs are still through the roof.
Yep.
And it costs a lot to produce that newspaper every day.
And deliver it.
And deliver it.
Yeah, and a daily delivery now, too. I mean, what you read, Errol, I think really tells a lot. It's what the people wanted all along. And so the owners of the paper have listened to this, and the community really, in the beginning, made its feelings known. People were extremely upset about that cutback in daily delivery, and so we're now back to it.
And when the Advocate first came into town, I guess you got to give the Manships, who were the owners of the Advocate, a little bit of credit too. But they started a little bit too fast. In some of those early Advocate issues, you look at the obituaries, and it had like death notices, like for Denham Springs,
right,
and in Plaquemine, Louisiana, and people would look at it and they say, "Well, this isn't us." And then gradually, as it became more and more New Orleans, the people in Baton Rouge were saying, "Well, this isn't us," and so they kind of got caught up a little bit, and they had problems with distribution. So it took a little while, but during that period, I think they lost potential customers.
But then John Georgia stepped in and bought it, and that was a big thing. Local ownership does mean a lot. Whether it's a newspaper or a TV station, you see very few local ownership in either medium anymore.
Because it takes a lot of deep pockets to make it work.
Of course it does.
Once again, it's down to the bottom line. But
still
local
is.
reporting, as you said, local newspapers are important. Local
Yeah, they
reporting is really, really very important. NOLA.com is now the website, right? That's where people need to go to read you guys online, as opposed to the New Orleans Advocate site.
All our content is on NOLA.com now.
And it does seem to have improved since you guys took it over.
Yeah.
Well, they had a
it
good
is.
website.
They had a well-known website. Sometimes it was hard to maneuver and find stories on NOLA.com.
Well, it is pretty easy to find the stories now.
That's what I'm
I
saying.
agree with you. I think it is.
I think it's improved.
It's more user-friendly. Okay. All right. Let me get over to Kathy right now. And so we had a guilty plea in FNBC bank failure from a pretty significant player in the whole
Very
thing.
significant, yeah. Well, this has been coming for a long time, of course, and this is referring to the first NBC bank failure in 2017. Mammoth. It was $1 billion cost to the taxpayers. They finally, the federal regulators came in, closed the bank, went into bankruptcy, and it's just been kind of chaos ever since. But this is big time stuff. It's a huge failure. It was the largest failure in the country, bank failure in the country since the 2008 recession. And the other thing that's always been, well, there have been several things about this that have just been stunning to me, but one is that this occurred in an environment where other banks were doing just fine. I mean, it was pretty much sunny skies or partly cloudy skies, at least for most banks in the state and in the country. I mean, they weren't failing. And so all of a sudden, this huge failure by this one bank that started after Hurricane Katrina and was founded by Ashton Ryan, who came out of the old First National Bank of Commerce. And so it was stunning from that aspect. It's stunning from the fact that this wasn't just, it wasn't market conditions. It wasn't an industry failure of some kind. They're alleged to have committed just outright fraud and conspiracy.
So this guilty plea came from whom?
Came from the top lawyer to the bank, Gregory St. Angelo. And of course, he knows where all the bodies are buried here. And obviously, the feds have turned him. He pled guilty, and his lawyer says that he is fully cooperating with the FBI and with the federal regulators and the federal government. So it certainly does not look good for Ashton Ryan. It hasn't looked good for a couple of years now. And for a couple of other people, inside the bank, as well as the bank's directors. You haven't heard too much about the bank's directors yet, but the board of directors carries a lot of liability.
Right.
And I think in this situation, there are a lot of shoes yet to fall.
And you probably talked to a lot of board members. I knew some board members. They thought, and they knew there were problems, they thought they could go ahead and push this through, and that with the Trump administration in, fewer regulations, that maybe the FDIC wouldn't pull the trigger so fast.
But boy, you can't overcome
they
things
did.
like taking out a new loan to pay off the
Right.
old loan. I mean, that's just, 101. You don't do that kind of thing. And usually when you see that happening, it's either a startup by somebody who's not very experienced and just trying to make money really fast, or somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. But that, again, it's stunning. Ashton Ryan has a long, long career in banking. He was an executive with one of the best banks in town. I often think of Ian Arnoff. Maybe you remember Ian Arnoff, who was the chairman of First National Bank of Commerce and worked with Ashton. And Ian since retired, and I believe he passed away in California. But I often think, he would just be horrified to know what's happened here.
And there've been a couple of other guilty pleas related to this, haven't there?
There have, from there are charges brought against a couple of clients of the bank who got loans that they should not have gotten under false pretenses and that sort of thing. There's just so much going on in this thing, and it's just, here's Ashton Ryan is well up in years.
Yeah.
The maximum sentence for bank fraud, should he be charged and convicted, is like 30 years. So, that
But
would
he
be
has
a
not
life
been charged
sentence.
yet.
He's not been charged yet.
It does
but-
seem like a lot of heads are going to roll
But
still.
when you see the top lawyer plead guilty, and they know Ryan and another executive in the bank are pretty much acknowledged targets of the FBI. So
So we're just beginning
not
to
looking
see
good.
what's going to unfold here.
yeah,
then.
this will go on for a while.
All righty, Kathy. Thanks a lot. Ramon, over to you. We hear reports, and you did a report now of taking a look at what's going on in the French Quarter. I mean, French Quarter is sort of the heart and soul of New Orleans, and we're hearing disturbing news that we're seeing an uptick in crime being committed there.
Yeah, my colleague Jeff Adelson and I guess, just crunching some numbers, found that I guess some of the violent crime numbers in the French Quarter have crept up. I certainly don't want to oversell at all and say that it's a significant uptick. It's crept up, and largely this will be pointed out by city leaders and was pointed out by us that that is a number that is driven by aggravated assaults, which are going to be. And it covers a wide range of behavior, from threats to verbal threats to pointing a weapon at somebody, whether a knife, a gun. It stops short of actually physically harming the victim in that case. I think what we've ended up finding, and it runs counter to what you would expect, I think, to the extra police and the amount of money that's spent to provide extra police presence in that area, as well as the proliferation of surveillance cameras. That there's also a lot of money spent into setting them up and having them feed into the real-time crime center, which itself was a multi-million-dollar facility. So what we found, at least, what that does provide is it is very difficult to get away with anything serious in terms of crime in the French Quarter. I mean, shootings and homicides are cleared at very, very high rate, 9 out of 10 or higher.
Because of these cameras?
And also
because
the police
of law
presence,
enforcement,
and of course, and so offenders are caught, within the neighborhood, if not at the scene. Armed robberies even are cleared at a 6 out of 10 rate. Where in the rest of the city, it's not even 4 out of 10. So, but that reality hasn't resulted in a deterrent effect that I think you might expect.
Because around the city we're seeing a drop in some crime rates, but we're not seeing that necessarily in the quarter. It's just sort of on track to match last year, which was high last year.
Yes, and it's crept up is kind of the term that we've been using. It certainly hasn't gone down, which has been. It was, I think, surprising, and certainly there's a discussion about what can be done and whether the resources that are deployed there can be done so more effectively. One thing that came up was the patchwork of police agencies that are there. You've got state police supplementing NOPD. Separate from that, you've got off-duty officers through the NOPD officers through like the French Quarter Task Force. And then on any given major event, you've got other agencies that are kind of supplying people. Obviously, NOPD is the only one that operates under its policies and procedures, and the other agencies, while are there to be extra boots on the ground, there's not necessarily controlled or governed by NOPD's regulations. And certainly, there's been a discussion to maybe bring that under NOPD in some form or fashion.
And the perception is because if it happens in the quarter, it just gets a whole lot more publicity. crazy.
Yes.
I mean, you think about that video, they showed that guy just walking down Bourbon Street swinging at people.
Right.
I mean, it's just frightening.
And you had the two shootings that were 18 hours apart on Bourbon Street. The one was
The woman at Cold Clover Grill is a domestic?
Yes, a domestic earlier that month. One of the shooting incidents, of course, was state police stopping a heavily inebriated, shooting a heavily inebriated driver from going the wrong way on Bourbon. You know. So there's also a spate of cases that on Bourbon, and it certainly creates an outsized, even if it doesn't reflect that, it remains relatively rare. You know, when you group a few of them together like that, it gives a frightening sensation.
It would seem that it's just happening more on Bourbon Street too.
Yes, well, I mean, there's been an accumulation of incidents that have happened in
and
recent months.
Of course, the shooting of the nurse, just the random shooting, right, which is so tragic.
It was a stray bullet.
It's that perception because it's the French Quarter. It's the lifeblood of this town.
And so business people and neighbors there, what are they feeling? Are they feeling less safe?
Well, I mean, certainly they've yeah, I mean, I think if you're like a stakeholder there, you know, we spent some time out there, and it doesn't feel like a neighborhood like in fear by any means. I mean, people are out there, people are going. I think if you're a stakeholder, the worry is if it gets worse or it doesn't get better, you will eventually see people maybe like thinking that it's kind of too rough to go there. Hasn't happened yet, and so certainly there's an urgency to figure something out to drive those numbers down.
Okay, all right, Ramon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Good reporting as always. Eric, over to you. We lost Dave Bartholomew recently, and then of course Fats. What about 2 years ago, year and a half, 2 years?
Yeah, a couple of years ago.
And they were,
and then Mac Rebenek.
Yeah, right, and Mac Rebenek too. But Fats Domino, Dave Bartholomew, I mean, they were a pair that really launched New Orleans R&B. It seems.
Of their day, of their generation, they were like the Lennon and McCartney. Yeah. I mean, together they pioneered so much stuff. And when they were being honored by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame back in 2010, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was calling them some of the fathers, if not the fathers, of rock and roll, with the 1949 song "The Fat Man." I mean, it was just, and that was Dave Bartholomew discovering Fats Domino. Within a couple of weeks after that, he got him in the studio. They recorded "The Fat Man," and boom, it was a hit.
It was just the beginning of what became absolutely incredible. I mean, it made an amazing impact on American music of the 20th century.
Oh yeah,
and they remained friends up to a point.
They did. They had a falling out probably back in the late 80s, 90s, somewhere. And you know, when you got two great talents like that together, two musical geniuses, something's going to rub off. And then Fats was always getting all the attention because he was Fats Domino. When Fats Domino walked into a room, he just lit up. It was Fats Domino. Dave did a lot of the heavy lifting. And you know, did a lot of the business end, things like that. And I asked them both when I interviewed them for a story I did, getting them back together after so many years apart. And I said, if there were not a Fats Domino, would there be a Dave Bartholomew? Without a Dave Bartholomew, would there be a Fats Domino? And without Cosmo Matassa to record you guys, would it have come? And they said, probably not. You know?
Glad that they got together. Now, Bartholomew was he a songwriter? Did he pen some of these songs?
Oh, yeah,
too?
He's in the Songwriter Hall of Fame, yeah.
Well, did he produce also?
All
of that?
Dave did it all. I mean, he did it all. He was a magnificent musician. He was a smart businessman, a great producer, a wonderful songwriter. And I mean, he didn't just write for Fats, he wrote for other people too. I mean, he was the real deal. And then you put those two together, and it's just like, wow. And when the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was going to honor them, I knew that there was angst between them because I'd heard it from each side because I was friends with each side. And so I called up Fats Domino's daughter and I said, "Do you think Fats would do it?" She says, "I'll ask him." And he said, "Sure." And then I called one of Dave's sons and I said, "You think Dave will do it?" "Absolutely not." And I said, "Well, would you ask Dave as a personal favor to me, would he consider it?" And after a lot of negotiations, it happened. We went over to Fat's house, and it was magic. I mean, they were like two kids together again. And then the families got back together. It was really neat.
And so they remained friends and friendly terms and communicating with each other up until the end of their lives.
And the kids stayed friends. You know, I remember when I got the news that David died, first person I called was Domino, Fatz's daughter. And she was out of town, and you know, she had already been on the phone with Don, one of Dave's sons. So yeah, they stayed close. It was cool.
Eric, back then you had local radio stations that were playing a lot of local music. You had like Cosmo Matassa in local recording. I've wondered if today, if you had a Dave Bartholomew and a Fats Domino, could they break it in New Orleans the same way? Would there still be the same opportunities?
They probably could. It's a whole different, you know, game now.
Right.
You know, they you know, go on iTunes or Spotify or whatever. I mean, you know, CD sales are down. Vinyl sales are up. It's a topsy-turvy world right now, not just in our business, but I mean in the music business and everything. You know, when artists launch a CD now, it's not that much. You want to get the hits online and streaming.
Right.
Streaming music is so much bigger now.
So much bigger, yeah. It's so much different distribution.
Yeah.
So I mean, talent like that, it would have come out.
Yeah, talent
somewhere.
is talent. You know.
Right. It definitely would have come out, and thank goodness it did, because it just brought us so much, and so much grew upon what they offered, what they provided.
Well,
what
yeah,
they gave us.
Dave was, you know, kind of the father of the New Orleans sound. So it's just like, and I remember the first interview I did with Fats Domino back in 2003 or 4, because he didn't do many interviews. And so Alan Toussaint came in the studio after the story had aired, and he walked in and he goes like this to me. Because I had talked to Fats Domino. And that just shows the reverence they had for these guys.
Right.
I mean, just the respect.
Well, you know, we're lucky to have been able to hear their music, hear their creativity. We still can, but also get to, you know, interact with them personally, too, because these guys were great. Okay, thanks a lot, Eric. Over to you, Ramon. Not so great story, but we're hearing an addition of priest names to credible accusations about sexual abuse.
Yes, the list that was released on November 2nd had the names of 55 priests and 2 deacons who had been credibly accused of sexually abusing minors. The list was amended and 4 names were added, so that list grows to 61, with a former Redemptorist by the name of Christopher Springer, 2 Holy Cross Order priests, Lawrence Dark and Archibald McDowell, and a Glen Mary home missioner who spent a brief time living at Loyola University, New Orleans, by the name of Robert Poandel. Believe all of them have, 3 of the 4 have passed away. And so again, it expands. I guess it expands the list, if you will, of people that are suspected predator priests.
And so, is it anticipated that we're going to continue to hear more and more names being?
I mean, it was something that was said on the first day. Certainly, the Archbishop made it clear that if there are other cases that kind of present themselves, they will be and are deemed credible, that they will be added. I think they were very clear about how they didn't expect the first list to be, you know, comprehensive. And certainly, I mean, we know of cases that certainly strike kind of outsiders as credible that aren't on there, and I mean, some of those cases have resulted in lawsuits, and their names haven't appeared on I guess what the church considers its list of credibly accused. We'll have to see if you know how much more that list may grow.
All right, thanks, Ramon. Kathy, wrap up with you. New Orleans Port, how's it doing?
Well, they've had a cargo growth, obviously. Just recently, the port purchased a couple of very expensive gantry cranes to add to its collection at Napoleon Avenue Wharf, which is their big container cargo wharf, excuse me. And they already have 2 of these cranes in operation and have had for a while, but their container cargo doubled over the past decade, and it's increasing faster and faster. Just last year, they had a 12 or 13% increase in cargo. The container cargo moves in those big boxcar-like containers that that actually can travel on a train, but they stack up on these flat ships.
And so you need those big cranes.
And you
to
need
move
those big cranes to go out there and magnetically pull them up and put them where they belong and so forth. So the cargo has increased in part because many shippers are using much larger ships these days. Part of the reason for that is the opening of the Panama Canal, which enabled a wider...
The widening of it. Yeah.
The widening of the Panama Canal, yes, which enabled the use of much larger, they call them actually Panamex vessels. And so some of those are coming into the Gulf ports now, and you have to be equipped to handle those. And many of them are going to the east or west coast, but some of it actually is coming into Gulf Coast ports as well. So there's that, and many shippers are using larger vessels in any case, whether or not they're going through the Panama Canal. So what's happening in New Orleans, one of the things that's happening in New Orleans is that the local port is benefiting from what's going on upriver from here, which is the petrochemical industry and all of those plants as you go up to Baton Rouge and beyond, and much of it which has been expanded in the last 6 to 10 years. And a lot of the petrochemicals, the resins, for instance, that are used by those plants come by container. So a lot of that is fueling the growth in container cargo in New Orleans, and Napoleon Avenue Wharf is the one where all of that is handled.
So our port continues to be one of the biggest in the nation, if not the world.
It depends on what kind of cargo
historically
you're talking about, and the New Orleans port always was a leading port in terms of bulk cargo, grains and liquid chemicals, and coffee, and it used to be bananas long ago, of course. So it was always a leading port in that sense, and it's coming on stronger and stronger in the containers. But as I said, so much more cargo is being shipped today in containers, so that's very important at all the ports that they get that kind of capacity. So it's a very, very competitive business.
And the cruise industry is picking up.
Right.
Cruise industry is going crazy.
So, I mean, it's gotten to be really big.
That's right.
So a lot of activity on the Mississippi River.
A lot of activity out there. Yeah, just take a look. You stand on the stand on the shore and look.
It's time now to look ahead. Errol.
Well, even though there's very little reason to believe that Louisiana is going to vote Democrat in the presidential election next year, there are a lot of Democratic candidates coming in within the next few days because of the Essence Festival. 4 candidates are coming into town, 4 Democratic candidates, and then on July 23rd, Joe Biden, for reasons undisclosed right now, but will also be coming into town too.
All right. Eric?
On Monday, they will lay to rest the great Dave Bartholomew, 100 years old. He would have turned 101 on Christmas Eve had he lived, but he was one of the greats, and just a sad day, but a big send-off for him.
Is there going to be
Probably
another
not.
big
It's going to
second
be
one?
just a service
Or
at
is
the
it just
church, yeah.
smaller? Okay. Kathy?
Well, Errol mentioned the Essence Festival, and I'll just touch on that. It's we're going to be in the midst of it shortly, and the local hotels are very excited about that because we're in the thick of the hot season, the July, August season, when things slow down a lot. So the hotels like Essence Festival.
All righty.
Just want to give a warm welcome to the former members of the Times Picayune who have joined the staff at the New Orleans Advocate for the combined paper. Wanted to extend congratulations to the former members of the Times Picayune who have gotten other jobs in journalism or in other industries following the change, and to those who are out of work as a result of the change. I hope your next opportunity comes quickly.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, we wish the best for all of them, and we're wishing all the best for this new paper. The Times Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, and all of the staff over there. All right, guys, thanks a lot for being here. Thank you all for joining us. Hope that you're having a great 4th of July weekend, and we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.